As we continue to preview the Philadelphia Eagles 2024 roster before training camp, we continue with wide receiver, which not a lot of question marks outside of the top two. We'll get into who's wide receiver 3 and more on this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Eagles fans? Welcome into this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. You can find our work over at Bleacher Report on top of every single day right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. And this week we are previewing the Philadelphia Eagles 2024 roster this week and next week, Gino, going position by position. We started with quarterback, talked a lot of Saquon Barkley at the running back position yesterday. Today we're going to talk about receiver, and this has been the theme now for 3 years, but it still feels nuts. Like there's not a lot of massive question marks, not any battles really for who's wide receiver 1, who's wide receiver 2. Mm-hmm. All of the question marks really have to do with the depth chart and just complementary pieces. As much as we've talked about who's wide receiver 3 this offseason and who are between veterans and rookies, who's going to step up. When you actually zoom out, most teams in the NFL, if they have 3 star passing targets like the Eagles do, that fourth guy isn't that much of a concern. So they're living pretty large right now at this position, all things considered.
When we get into these episodes on the wide receiver and tight end discussion, we always get into the depth profile.
Because we're so zoomed in. I mean, we do a show every day. There's only so much to talk about with A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith.
And when you just look at it for what it is, the Eagles are stacked at wide receiver.
Yeah, they have the best weapons in the NFL.
Something that they probably haven't had since, the 80s and 90s, the days of Quick and Carmichael, right?
Yeah, 2020, we would have been talking about is Johnny Wilson or Ainias Smith wide receiver 1 or 2.
Dude, what a world. I mean, I remember when Dennis Kelly was traded for Dorial Green-Beckham to Ed.
So did I thought he was going to be a stud.
Josh Huff and Nelson Aguilar, and you're saying this is the group that they're surrounding a young Carson Wentz with. And how far removed are we from that to where Howie Roseman, hats off to him, this is one position where he truly has learned his lesson and for the better. Because you invested $55 million APY in 2 guys, in A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith, who warranted that money and have helped elevate the play of Jalen Hurts. And it's only going to continue to flourish. I think one of the talking points that we've discussed on our shows, especially around the time of the draft, going back years now, the young wide receivers that they bring in, we want them to grow with the quarterback and truly just have this relationship, build these Aaron Rodgers, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, they can hit the back shoulder throw without even having to say anything to each other, right? Just have that telepathy between receiver and quarterback. And in today's NFL, passing the football is how you win the game. And Jalen Hurts, he almost took him to the Mecca in a shootout through the air against Patrick Mahomes. So to get back to that, we always have to start at the top and just realize how excellent they are with wide receiver 1A and 1B. Now, if you're in a situation like you were last year where A.J. Brown, who does have some injuries on his track record, if he's out, who's the next guy up? Sure. Where are the players that are going to step up? And I think this Eagles room in 2024 is going to have a competitive element that is going to push a lot of these young guys. Some veterans like Parris Campbell are going to help push the envelope, but it has to be better. It cannot be what Quez Watkins gave you the last couple years at that third wide receiver position, regardless of what you have at the top.
I agree. Yeah. In a vacuum, wide receiver 3 needs to be, when that number is called, and it's rarely called, but when it is, the efficiency needs to be better.
Yes.
But the volume doesn't have to be there, and that's one thing, again, we need to put in perspective. Most teams, if their top 2 receivers go down, are not going to be in an ideal situation. So the Eagles are in a better position than almost, if not anybody, at this spot at wide receiver, because as you mentioned, Gino, Howie Roseman has learned from his mistakes, and honestly, has there ever been a GM that's invested more at the receiver position? at least within the last 10 years when it comes to like a combination of first, second round picks, big contracts, trades. Some have worked, some haven't. But when you look at it, man, like he paid Alshon Jeffrey. He gave Nelson Aguilar an extension. He traded for Golden Tate. He spent 1s and 2s on Jalen Reagor and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside and DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown. Like, he has spent so much money and so many draft picks at this position. And luckily now we're definitely seeing the benefits, the rewards of that.
I think the discussion on has he been somebody who has invested the most probably comes from the survivor element of him being around for so long.
That's fair. Yeah, it's probably not a fair discussion because most people don't have that leash for sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking over the last couple of years, like a team like Cincinnati, they've put a pretty fair amount.
But this was only in like a 5-year span. It's not like this is like decades and decades of a resume. Like he has invested a ton, even since like 2018, 2019.
Where I will give him credit is his ability to change his evaluation process on this position, where if you look at a team like Pittsburgh, they've been probably the best team at evaluating and drafting wide receivers and landing them.
They never miss.
Not in the first round, like outside of the first round, and absolutely nailing those picks, right? The Eagles haven't been so lucky, man. Even on their first round picks, they haven't been great. Heck, going back to the years of drafting Reggie Brown. No, was it who did they draft in 2006? Not Reggie Brown.
It was Reggie Brown.
Yeah, Reggie Brown. Yeah, exactly. And you're like, man, that kid could come in and contribute in this room and didn't do anything for this Philadelphia Eagles team. It was a flash in a pan. And Nelson Aguilar, yeah, he did win you a Super Bowl, but did he get you to that second and third contract like you would like on your number one receiver that you drafted in the first round? Well, luckily the Eagles have lucked into a former GM trading you A.J. Brown for pennies on the dollar, and you jumped the New York Giants, who were going to draft DeVonta Smith, because Howie Roseman learned that if you want to acquire the best at this position, you have to be willing to roll the dice and take chances. I mean, look at the draft when Jameson Williams and Chris Olave and all those guys went so early on. Teams started to realize that wide receiver, it's not a luxury. It is a necessity. Look at what Justin Jefferson just got paid. Look at what A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith just got paid. You have to have not one, not two, multiple very good to elite pass catchers in the NFL to win championships.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's never been a time where teams invest more at this position. And as you mentioned, like you look at the flurry of contracts right now, that shows it. And the Eagles have two guys locked up. They've had back-to-back 1,000-yard years together, A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith. I think I'm very confident both will eclipse that 1K mark again. And I was doing some research before the show, like I thought about that. How many wide receiver duos have had 1,000 yards in 3 consecutive years together? Of course, like some legendary duos have Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce. They did it 3 years straight. So did Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne. But there's not that many on this list. Like recently, some guys that are in the league right now, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans have done that, and so have Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. But DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown, if they do that this year, like they're in special company.
And I think that's the expectation year over year, and that's what you put as a benchmark when they are signing the dotted line on that contract. And if you want, going back to the discussion of Jalen Hurts the other day when we were talking about quarterback, him to be a 4,000-yard passer, you have to guarantee that his top two guys are at least going to give you 2,000 yards. Bare minimum.
I was going to say, that's the minimum, because A.J. Brown's sniffing 1,400 every single year.
Yeah.
And DeVonta should have more than, to me, do you know what he's had the last 2 years?
I mean, we'll get into the over-under discussion, but you're sitting there right now and you're saying if these guys are fully healthy, could they each eclipse 1,500 yards on the season? That's where they should be looking. And I think that's a realistic possibility, Lou, because if Dallas Goedert, once again, isn't healthy, and the discussion we're going to have in our next topic here on these young guys stepping up, if they don't,
they're going to have to have 1,500 a year.
Nick Sirianni says it. We pass the ball to A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, and Dallas Goedert for a reason. That's our offense, right? And you got to when the guys are that good. And they have stepped up in the best of ways, too. And, Lou, I think before we switch over to kind of some of these role players, how A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith have stepped up in the biggest of moments, I think is ultimately why you feel safe paying them that money. And maybe how he got caught up in the Alshon winning them a Super Bowl to pay him a little bit more.
Yeah, because
do him a
Alshon
little
was
bit of
clutch. That's a
favor.
fair point.
Yeah, for sure. And now you look at these guys and you're saying you're going to pay them for what they're going to do. You're expecting they're going to continue to be top-level football players in the highest moments, in the playoffs, in Super Bowls. I mean, these guys are so young still, Lou. They're so young, and they just signed.
That's the exciting part. Well, and we've said on the show before, man.
This is A.J. Brown's
go ahead.
third contract, which is crazy, and
Yeah.
DeVonta Smith is just on his second contract, which he's not even going to be out of his rookie deal until after this season. That's where you're looking for is the future, especially in 2024. They're already great players. Like, what is the ceiling on these guys?
It's how you sustain success. Like outside of course, having the trenches be set up, having this trio of Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, like that's the most important dynamic to keep you in games and in seasons being in the Super Bowl window year after year. So I think we're very confident in that trio for sure heading into 2024. Not as confident about the players behind them, but there are definitely some names that could emerge as upgrades compared to the Quez Watkins of the world and the Olamide Zaccheaus from 2023. We'll get into those players coming up next as we continue to preview wide receiver right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. But not just the MLB, the NFL, the NHL, of course, Stanley Cup's still going on when the NBA is back. You can get everything over at Game Time, but also concerts, comedy, theater, and more, where you can save up to 60% buying last-minute tickets through Game Time. Plus, on top of the great prices, you're going to get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know you're also getting a great view. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create that account. Redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, got to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? We'll make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you canvas analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're previewing wide receiver today on Locked On Eagles. And again, Gino, as we mentioned, segment one, A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, they lead the way. This offense is basically going to run through those two players. Of course, as well, Dallas Goedert and Saquon Barkley are a big part. But it's number 11 and it's number 6 before anything else. Like, that's the engine, outside of Jalen Hurts, of course, that is going to make this passing game run. Behind them, again, it's not a problem of, like, quantity, right? Like, these guys have to have a big role in the offense this year. But the problem has been the last few years, and we thought Quez Watkins was going to be the perfect complement to DeVonta and Brown and Goddard, like just target monsters, is that deep threat, someone that can get more meat off the bones when their number is called. And it's just been the complete opposite. These guys only have their number called a few times a game. And it's like, every time that's happened, they just have not stepped up. And it wasn't just Quez. It was, Julio Jones had a couple moments last year, but he's a shell of who he used to be. And Olamide Zaccheaus was kind of underwhelming as well. They just, even Zach Pascal 2 years ago, they just haven't really been able to get that wide receiver 3 spot right.
And once again, they're going down the old track of, can a former Indianapolis Colt step up in that wide receiver 3 position?
Another Nick Sirianni guy, yeah.
We'll see. I think Parris Campbell should be a big fan of Kellen Moore and how he could potentially use him in this offense. And if you look back over Kellen Moore's tenure, that third wide receiver does play an instrumental role in the passing offense. I think to those years of Cedric Wilson, which ended up getting him a contract from Miami. He absolutely dominated as that wide receiver 3 when Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb were there at the time. And now all of a sudden you have an influx of young talent in Ainias Smith and now Johnny Wilson. And those guys are cut from 2 different cloths, man. You draft the tallest wide receiver in the draft and one of the shorter wide receivers in the draft, but you really don't have a player like Ainias Smith outside of Britton Covey on the roster.
Right.
How could a player like that, who has very good short area quickness and has that vision in the open field, where if you just get him the football, he could contribute in those areas that we are talking about. And Kellen Moore, he's going to be instrumental in getting these guys the football easily and helping out them getting into the NFL, just putting one foot in front of the other, because you don't want to make it hard on them. You don't want to do what Brian Johnson did last year, where nobody that is not a man-beating wide receiver can go out there and run the offense because you don't help them and don't elevate them. Kellen Moore is going to help them, and I think you'll see situations where Johnny Wilson should probably be the next guy up at the X receiver position, if we're being honest. Because
it's not going to be Parris Campbell, and it's not going to be Ainias Smith, which is crazy, Gino. Right now, Johnny Wilson is probably your wide receiver 3 on the boundary. Yeah.
Unless somebody like Joseph Nada continues to elevate his game, but it should be Johnny Wilson. I mean, you invested a draft pick in him. You and I liked him a lot more than where he was drafted.
I thought he was going to be a 3rd or 4th round pick.
Having 2 guys in AJ and DeVonta to help him maneuver into the NFL is going to be huge. And the same thing with a young player in Ainias Smith. And at the same time, how are they going to use the running backs in this department? How is Grant Calcaterra potentially going to be a pseudo wide receiver 3? Because Nick Sirianni has mentioned that as well. But if I had to guess at one player out of this group to take a step and be sort of this wide receiver 3,
like
that
the most reliable
on, I'm going to say Smith, because I think you could just give him the ball in space, figure out ways on like jet and orbit motion to just give him
I think he fits the offense the best.
And he's going to be somebody that everybody else's eyes are going to be on the big 3 in Saquon Barkley. And then you're going to forget about this guy who's really, really good in the open field. And Kellen Moore is going to remember, let's just get him the ball, make Jalen's job a lot easier. Don't make Jalen have to go and scramble and pick up these 10 to 15-yard games where he's getting hit 2 to 3 times. Give the ball to these guys who are young, quick, explosive. And why Howie Roseman drafted them is because Kellen Moore probably has his fingerprints on these selections like Will Shipley and Ainias Smith and Johnny Wilson. Because if you look at the Jalen Hunt pick on the other side of the football,
it was a Vic Fangio
biggest fan. It was a Fangio pick. So of course they're going to make selections that.
Well, and Parris Campbell's a similar style too, Gino, 100%. To Ainias Smith. So I think both of those guys fit in really well in that way. I think both of them will be used probably more in the offense from a 17-game perspective if there aren't injuries compared to Johnny Wilson. But I do think you're right. If there was an injury, like unless you go out there and sign or trade for another receiver, Johnny's the guy on the outside. And I think this is the perfect situation for him because you look at A.J. Brown's a more physical, bigger receiver that can help him learn how to use his body type at this level, how to separate at this level with that style, because he doesn't have the footwork or the route running of DeVonta Smith. But having a guy like DeVonta in-house too to learn from his footwork and how he separates too, like, of course, Johnny Wilson's never going to be able to do some of the things DeVonta Smith can, but that's one of the best separators in the league that you're also learning from. So Wilson, Howie said it himself, like this is a guy that, he's not your typical plotting 6'7" receiver that has to move to tight end. Like he has rare lower body movement for a guy that, I mean, he's the tallest receiver to come into the league out of the draft in I think like 10, 15 years. Like he's a generational type of player from a body type perspective, but he can move well, and learning from DeVonta and AJ in that way, I think really will be able to benefit him to where if he's out there on the field, this isn't going to be an Ifeanyi Moma, Carlton Agudosi situation where the Eagles brought in these giants that can't move. Like I don't think that's Johnny.
If you saw the clips that the Eagles had put out from OTAs and some of the beat reporters, they were short, but just seeing him move in those drills, like you had said, even a player like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who was closer to 6'2", didn't move as well and
couldn't beat a rock off the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, and Wilson, what he did really well down at Florida State, and him and Keon Coleman, I think, kind of mirrored each other in that department. 50-50 ball catchers. Could he be right away a target for you down in the red zone? Absolutely. That's a mismatch nightmare, Lou. What about the possibility of lining him, AJ, Dallas, and DeVonta all up on the field at the same time and taking the Chip Kelly big people beat up little people moniker? And how many teams can line up size-wise at the cornerback or defensive back
Yeah,
position.
if you can get Johnny Wilson lined up on one of these smaller slot corners,
Dingo was his
that's
name,
the thing.
though.
None of these guys are complete players. They all have specific strengths, but I think that's why it's going to be, and as you mentioned, Ainias Smith or Parris Campbell probably has the best chance to be the most reliable. But it's going to be wide receiver 3 by committee because of those different traits they have. They're going to all be asked to do very different things. So I think there's not going to be one clear and obvious guy that is, at least in my opinion, is wide receiver 3 unless the 2 rookies just do not develop.
When you look at drafting players on day 3, you always look for 1 or 2 things that they do very good to exceptionally well. Johnny Wilson, I mean, you take his body profile, size, his ability to catch the ball at its highest point, 50-50 ball catcher. Ainias Smith, his just ability to scoot around an open field. And same with Parris Campbell to an extent where what does he do well? You got to use him in space. And I think Kellen Moore is going to help deliver these guys the ball in space for the guys like Smith and Parris Campbell. And I think there's going to be opportunities for a guy in the red zone like Johnny Wilson, because if he's dressing and he's on the field, there's going to be situations when you are going to ask him to say, hey, that guy is only 5'11". Just go up and catch the football. Like, that's just simple. Break it down to go above the rim, play above the rim. Howie Roseman always harps on that. Look at AJ, look at DeVonta, something those guys do really well. Who's to say that they can't come and learn right away from these exceptionally good football players in DeVonta and AJ who do everything very, very, very good to elite?
They do, and their numbers reflect that for sure, Gino. Their numbers have been incredible over the last few seasons with Philadelphia. We'll get into some over-unders for AJ, DeVonta, and the wide receiver 3 position coming up next as we continue this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles.
As we roll along on this Thursday, today's episode of LOE is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. But FanDuel is going international right now. Some of the biggest soccer tournaments on the globe are going on. Forza Azzurri in the Euros right now. You have Copa America going on. You got football in every form coming up over the next couple months. And if you are a new customer to FanDuel, you can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on anything from the Euro MVP to how many goals Messi is going to score to who could potentially be the offensive player of the year in the NFL. That's $200 by winning a $5 bet. Right now, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and win big this summer and put some cash in your pocket to spend with some friends this summer season. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Once again, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to take advantage of that.
All right, Eagles fans, we're wrapping up this wide receiver preview with some over-unders right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, and the numbers have been pretty phenomenal for A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith the last 2 years, both eclipsing 1,000 yards in 2022-2023. A.J. Brown himself eclipsing 1,400 yards, almost had 1,500 in 2022. He had 1,496. This past year, he had 106 catches for 1,456. Got hurt, though, remember, so could have had even more. Gino, it comes to the over-unders for AJ and DeVonta. From a yardage perspective, DeVonta had 1,066 last year. He was also injured. I don't want to say I want to take the under by a lot for AJ Brown from 1,456, but I will say under a little bit because I think DeVonta's is going to be over that 1,066. I think closer to that 1,200 mark. I would hope DeVonta Smith, A.J. Brown, I think it's going to level out a little more where they're closer to being both around the same number. I think Brown still will probably be the wide receiver 1 from a stat perspective. Like, he'll outproduce DeVonta, but I think it'll be closer than it was last year.
So from a duo perspective, what would you put the number at?
So last year it was at, almost 2,500? I would say over.
Over 2,500?
I would like it to be around 26 to 27. I want DeVonta to sniff 1.3 and A.J. Brown to continue to be around that 1.4 range.
I realistically think 2,750 could be the number that if you look at this duo between AJ getting close to 1,500 in 2022. And
DeVonta was 4 yards away from being at 1,200.
There you go. And I think he's going to eclipse 1,300 yards at some point in his career. And that's why you pay him $25 million a year. And you have to remember that you also have somebody in DeVonta who on his own is an elite football player.
Yep.
And
he could be a 1,400-yard receiver, Gino, in the right offense.
Many other teams, if he was that guy.
If the Eagles gave him the A.J. Brown target share, he would have those numbers.
Look at what he did before A.J. was even in the mix, man. I mean, his rookie season was one that you hadn't seen in quite some time watching Eagles football. And as a duo, I think 2750 is going to be very close. I still think they hammer the over because guys like Saquon are now in the mix. It's going to make his job easier, and just Kellen Moore using motion is going to help those guys out a lot. Let's just continue to pump those overs in the passing game.
Yeah, receptions wise too, like DeVonta had 81 last year. He was injured. He had 95 the year before. I would take the over on the 81. A.J. Brown had 106 last year. Do we take the under there? Just because DeVonta is probably going to get more. I mean, A.J. Brown for 6 games was double digits every single week. I don't know if that kind of run's coming again.
It's probably 200 between them, and I think A.J. would probably just law of averages see a little bit of a drop off. I think,
and if Goddard is healthy, and remember, Dallas Goddard last year there were times even when he was healthy, he was not as involved in the offense as he was in years past. No, they would just not even
pass him the football.
Yeah, so
I'm going to say A.J. Brown also is going to be a little bit more efficient this year, which is going to be crazy to say, but I think he's going to have more opportunities in the open field, and I think he's going to take some of these balls that were more 50-50 plays, just maybe he's going to get it.
Not a bad point, you know, his yards per average catch last year was 13.7. The year before it was 17, so the efficiency
even if he goes up to 15.5, you're talking about better efficiency with less catches.
So at wide receiver 3, the numbers were brutal last year. Quez Watkins, he finished the season with a little over 100 yards, 142. OZ had 164, and then Julio Jones at 74. I would want to say that between Ainias Smith, Johnny Wilson, and Parris Campbell, it's over that mark. I mean, that's a little over, 300 yards?
I think all of them are probably going to eclipse the highest number in that total, which is not very impressive, but one of those guys should get close to 400 yards. If
you would hope so.
We're talking about the other two guys getting close to 2750. Wide receiver 3 gets you 300 to 400 yards. You're talking about 3,100. Dallas giving you another 800.
Right.
And then Saquon. I mean, I don't know, man. Like, are they just going to hammer home the A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith point?
Plus Saquon Barkley being a part. Yeah, do you know, it's actually, I mean, maybe we do take the under, or just like that's the floor, because Saquon's going to be far more involved
between them.
Yeah, and Dallas Goddard, if he does stay healthy, like you said, he's normally been an 700 to 800 yard tight end. Saquon's going to have a lot more than the 200 receiving yards.
That's not
Swift
a bad
had.
thing, I guess, because you're giving a better football play.
I agree, but at the same time, like those yardage totals last year were so low. You would hope, efficiency-wise, one of them is over. I'll take the over. One of those guys is going to have over the 320-something yards those guys had combined last year. If it's not much higher, I want to say between the
Let's
three.
Let's say Ainias Smith does that, and then
let's say as a group
Wilson just doesn't play much, and he's not on the field because AJ and DeVonta are healthy, and then Parris Campbell and Smith kind of carry you to 400 to 500 yards somehow.
Yeah.
The Saquon, you want to hammer him in the pass.
I agree.
And same with Dallas Goddard if he's healthy as well, because you can't forget about the player that he was and who he probably still is if he's fully healthy.
Yeah, I agree. We'll move over to tight end and offensive line this week as we continue to preview the Philadelphia Eagles 2024 roster before training camp gets going in July. That'll do it for today's show, though. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.